The courtroom was silent, thick with tension as Officer Mark Rollins and Jake Tanner sat frozen, their faces drained of color. Across from them, Samuel "Sam" Hayes adjusted his tie, his expression unreadable. The judge's voice rang out, firm and unwavering. Given the overwhelming evidence of racial profiling and misconduct, disciplinary action is inevitable. Gasps filled the room. Sam leaned forward, his voice steady but sharp. "I am Chief Samuel Hayes, the man you unlawfully arrested, and I'm here to make sure this never happens again." The officer's jaws dropped. How had they let this happen? How had they not known? And more importantly, what would come next? Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in justice, hit like and subscribe for more eye-opening stories. Samuel "Sam" Hayes had spent decades fighting for justice, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to face in the very city where he had been appointed as its first black police chief. He had taken the job just 3 weeks earlier, stepping into a department with a long history of misconduct, racial profiling, and deep-seated prejudice. Some officers resented his presence, whispering behind his back, questioning why someone like him had been given the role. But Sam wasn't naive. He knew change would be met with resistance. What he didn't expect was how quickly the resistance would turn into something far worse. That evening, he had just finished a long day of back-to-back meetings with community leaders, discussing initiatives for rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the people they served. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him, but he was used to carrying it. As he drove through the quiet suburban streets toward home, he exhaled, allowing himself to relax for the first time that day. His wife had texted him earlier, reminding him that his favorite meal was waiting for him on the table. He smiled at the thought, his fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel. The sun had set, casting a golden hue over the town, and the streets were nearly empty. His unmarked black SUV blended into the surroundings, nothing about it drawing attention. He glanced at the speedometer. He was well under the limit, not that he had any reason to worry. Then out of nowhere, the piercing glare of red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. A sinking feeling settled in his gut, but he forced himself to stay calm. He checked his dashboard again. No broken lights, no traffic violations, nothing that would warrant a stop. And yet the sirens blared insistently behind him, demanding compliance. He flicked on his turn signal and pulled over to the side of the road, his heartbeat steady, but his mind racing. He knew the drill all too well. Hands on the wheel, movements slow, demeanor respectful. He had given this advice to countless young black men before, warning them that even the smallest misstep could mean the difference between walking away and becoming another statistic. His pulse remained steady, but he was fully aware of what could happen next. The gravel crunched beneath approaching boots, and within seconds, 2 uniformed officers flanked his vehicle. Officer Mark Rollins and Officer Jake Tanner, 2 men Sam had been briefed about during his first week in office. Rollins, an officer with a record of excessive force complaints, had somehow evaded disciplinary action time and time again. Tanner, younger and more eager, followed Rollins's lead in everything, including his prejudices. Sam kept his hands, visible as Rollins approached the driver's side window, his flashlight already trained on Sam's face. "License and registration," Rollins ordered, his tone sharp, not a request, but a command. Sam nodded, moving deliberately. "I'm reaching for my registration now. My license is in my wallet. I'll get it after this." Rollins didn't acknowledge the courtesy, his posture tense. Tanner lingered near the back of the SUV, one hand resting lightly on his holstered weapon, the other running along the trunk as if searching for an excuse to escalate. Sam retrieved his documents, handing them over, but Rollins barely glanced at them before letting out a scoff. "Samuel Hayes? Figures. We get a lot of Hayeses around here." The implication was clear. Another black man, another problem. Sam forced himself to remain composed. "May I ask why I was pulled over, officer?" Rollins smirked. "You were swerving back there, reckless driving." Sam frowned. That was a lie, and they both knew it. "I have a dash cam," he said evenly. "It will show that I was driving within my lane at all times." Rollins' smirk didn't falter. "Oh yeah? Let's see how that works when your car disappears." Sam's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. He had dealt with men like Rollins before, officers who wielded their power like a weapon, who operated under the assumption that no one would hold them accountable. Tanner moved closer now, his eyes scanning Sam's clothing, the watch on his wrist, his general demeanor. "What are you doing in a neighborhood like this?" Tanner asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Going home," Sam answered simply. Rollins exchanged a look with Tanner before stepping back. "Step out of the vehicle." Sam hesitated. "Is there a reason for this, officer? I've complied with everything." "Step out of the vehicle now," Rollins barked. The escalation was happening, quickly. Sam took a steady breath, then unbuckled his seatbelt, moving slowly as he pushed open the door. As soon as he was out, Tanner grabbed his arm roughly, yanking him toward the hood of the SUV. "Spread your legs," Tanner ordered, patting him down aggressively. "What exactly are you looking for?" Sam asked, his voice measured. "Anything that might explain why you're acting so damn nervous," Rollins shot back. Sam almost laughed. He wasn't nervous, he was calculating. This was going exactly as he had expected. Tanner pulled out Sam's wallet and examined his ID again. "This doesn't look real," he muttered. Sam's patience thinned. "It's a government-issued ID, officer." "Oh yeah? Looks a little too polished. For someone like you." Another jab, another attempt to provoke him. Sam stayed silent. He knew where this was going. "Turn around, hands behind your back," Rollins ordered. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice." The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around Sam's wrists, biting into his skin. The absurdity of it all was almost comical. He had spent years building a career rooted in justice, in fairness, in holding officers like these accountable. And now, here he was, being subjected to the very abuse of power he had vowed to dismantle. He glanced down the street. A few neighbors peered through their blinds, their silhouettes barely visible against the warm glow of their living rooms. No one stepped outside. They never did. As Tanner and Rollins shoved him toward the squad car, he caught sight of a young, black man standing on the sidewalk, his phone in hand, recording. Their eyes met for a brief second. Sam didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The video would speak for itself. The door slammed behind him, and the squad car rumbled to life. As they pulled away, Rollins and Tanner exchanged smug glances. "Another one off the streets," Rollins muttered. Sam remained silent. He had no intention of staying silent for long. The squad car's engine hummed as Officer Rollins and Tanner drove through the dimly lit streets, the glow of streetlights casting flickering shadows inside the vehicle. Sam sat in the back, his wrists aching from the too tight handcuffs. But his mind was sharp, analyzing every move, every word exchanged between the two officers. Rollins kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror, his smirk widening every time their eyes met. "So, what's your story?" Tanner finally asked, turning slightly in his seat. "Late-night drug run? Or just out looking for trouble?" Sam met his gaze with a steady calmness. "Just a man trying to get home." "Yeah, sure," Rollins scoffed, shaking his head. "Reckless drivers always have an excuse." Sam knew better than to argue. He had nothing to prove to these men. The truth didn't matter to them. They had already decided who he was the moment they saw his face. The drive stretched on, and Sam realized they weren't heading directly to the precinct. Instead, they took the long route, making unnecessary turns, as if they were deliberately delaying the process. He had seen this tactic before, keep the suspect in custody just long enough to make them sweat, to instill fear. But Sam wasn't afraid. He was calculating. When they finally pulled into the precinct's parking lot, Rollins and Tanner exchanged a look before stepping out. The back door swung open, and Rollins yanked Sam out with unnecessary force. "Watch your step," he said mockingly. They led him through the station's entrance, past other officers who barely spared them a glance. Some nodded in approval, assuming it was just another arrest, just another black man booked for the night. Sam took note of every face, every single one who looked away. The intake process was slow, deliberately so. Rollins handled his paperwork with an exaggerated nonchalance, flipping through pages as if debating what to charge him with. Reckless driving, he muttered to himself. Resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, yeah, that should stick. Sam raised an eyebrow. Resisting? I complied with every order. Rollins grinned. That's not how I remember it. Sam exhaled, sharply. This was textbook. Falsifying reports, twisting the truth to justify their actions. He had spent years training officers on why this behavior eroded public trust, and now he was watching it unfold firsthand. Tanner nudged Rollins, whispering something under his breath. Rollins nodded, grabbing Sam's wallet again, flipping through it slowly. This ID, he said, waving it slightly, doesn't feel right to me. Sam's jaw tightened. It's real. You're awfully confident for someone sitting in cuffs, Rollins remarked. And that's the problem. You people always think you're untouchable. You people. Sam had lost count of how many times he had heard that phrase throughout his life. But this time, it carried a different weight. These men weren't just making assumptions about him, they were determined to break him. We should run his prints, Tanner suggested. See if anything pops up, Rollins smirked. Not a bad idea. Sam stayed silent as they dragged him to a side room, forcibly pressing his fingers onto the scanner. He didn't fight it. He didn't resist. He just waited. And then, something happened that neither officer expected. The screen displayed his full record, and next to his name were the words, Chief of Police, appointed 3 weeks ago. Rollins's face paled slightly. Tanner blinked, clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. Sam didn't react. He simply watched, waiting to see what they would do next. Rollins cleared his throat, forcing a laugh. Must be a mistake, he muttered, quickly backing out of the screen. Yeah, system glitches all the time, Tanner added hastily. Sam said nothing. He could see the fear creeping into their expressions, the realization that they had just arrested the very man who had the power to dismantle their careers. But instead of admitting their mistake, instead of apologizing, they doubled down. Let's put him in holding for the night, Rollins said quickly. Let the higher-ups deal with it in the morning. Tanner hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, let's not make a big deal out of this. And just like that, Sam was led down a long, dimly lit hallway and thrown into a holding cell, the door clanging shut behind him. The room was small, cold, the walls lined with graffiti from past detainees. A flickering overhead light cast a sickly glow over the single bench in the corner. Sam sat down, his hands resting on his lap, his expression unreadable. Outside, he could hear Rollins and Tanner talking, their voices lower now, more anxious. They knew they had messed up, but instead of correcting it, they were trying to cover it up. Sam inhaled deeply, then exhaled slowly. He wasn't angry, he was patient. He knew that by morning, the truth would come out, and when it did, there would be consequences. But the question was, would justice be served? Comment number 1 if you believe these officers should be held accountable. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because what happens next will change everything. The hours dragged by in the cold, dimly lit holding cell, but Samuel Hayes remained still, his mind far from idle. He had faced adversity before, but never quite like this, never at the hands of the very institution he was sworn to lead. The air in the precinct buzzed with the usual late-night energy. Officers shuffling papers, answering phones, processing other detainees. No one seemed particularly interested in the black man sitting silently in the cell, waiting. That was the problem, wasn't it? They never looked, never paid attention until it was too late. Sam clasped his hands together, his gaze steady on the barred door, listening. Rollins and Tanner were somewhere nearby, whispering in hurried tones, their nervous energy betraying their fear. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected him. But instead of correcting their mistake, they were trying to bury it. That was the real crime. Not the false arrest, not the racial profiling, though those were bad enough, but the fact that even now, knowing the truth, they still refused to do the right thing. A low chuckle echoed from the opposite side of the holding cell, pulling Sam from his thoughts. An older black man, dressed in tattered clothes, leaned against the wall, arms crossed. His eyes, sharp despite his weary appearance, studied Sam with an expression that was both amused and resigned. "Ain't the first time I seen one of us in here?" the man murmured, his voice rough with age and experience. "And it sure as hell won't be the last." Sam tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the man without speaking. The old man smirked. "Something tells me you ain't like the others, though. You too calm, too sure of yourself. That's different." Sam finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "I know how this works." "Yeah?" The old man laughed, shaking his head. "That's what I thought too once. Thought I knew the system. Thought I could beat it. But the system don't like to lose." Sam didn't argue. He understood what the man was saying. For years, he had worked within the system, trying to fix it from the inside. He believed in justice, in accountability. But tonight had proven just how broken things really were. Even when faced with undeniable truth, people like Rollins and Tanner would rather bend reality than admit fault. And they weren't alone. They were just a symptom of something much bigger. A heavy sigh filled the silence, and the old man rubbed his temples. "So what they got you in for? Breathing too loud?" "Reckless driving," Sam answered simply. The old man barked a laugh. "And let me guess, you weren't driving reckless at all." "Not even a little." "Figures." The conversation was cut short by the sound of approaching footsteps. A new voice, sharper, more authoritative, rang through the precinct. "Where is the suspect from last night's traffic stop?" The voice belonged to Lieutenant Anna Ramirez, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach to leadership. Unlike Rollins and Tanner, she didn't play games, and she certainly didn't tolerate incompetence. Sam had read her file when he first arrived in town. She was one of the few officers who had a history of pushing back against department misconduct. And now, she was here. Sam could see her from his position in the cell, standing at the front desk, flipping through a folder with a deepening frown. Rollins and Tanner hovered nearby, visibly tense. "We picked him up for reckless driving," Rollins explained, trying to sound casual. Ramirez didn't look convinced. "And where's the dashcam footage?" Tanner shifted uncomfortably. We didn't get to that yet." "Didn't get to it?" Ramirez snapped, narrowing her eyes. "You arrested someone without reviewing evidence?" Rollins swallowed hard. "We had probable cause. Is that right?" Ramirez tapped a few keys on the computer, pulling up something on the screen. Her expression darkened as she read. "Tell me, officers, were you aware that the man you arrested is Chief Samuel Hayes?" Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Tanner's face went pale. Rollins' jaw clenched. Ramirez slowly turned to face them, crossing her arms. "Well?" Rollins cleared his throat. We thought his ID was fake." Ramirez exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You didn't think. That's the problem. You profiled him, arrested him without cause, and now you're scrambling because you know this is going to blow up in your faces." She turned toward the cell, meeting Sam's gaze for the first time. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something that wasn't pity, but perhaps recognition. A moment later, she grabbed the keys from the hook near the desk and marched toward the cell, unlocking the door with swift efficiency. "Chief Hayes," she said evenly, "you're free to go." Sam stood slowly, rolling his shoulders as the tension in his muscles eased. He stepped out of the cell without a word, his gaze flickering briefly to Rollins and Tanner. Their smug confidence from the night before had completely evaporated. Now they looked like men who had just realized they were standing at the edge of a cliff. Ramirez didn't spare them another glance as she led Sam down the hallway toward her office. "I need to speak with you privately," she said, her voice clipped but professional. Sam nodded, following her into the stark, undecorated office. Once. Inside, Ramirez shut the door behind them and gestured for him to sit. "I reviewed your dashcam footage," she began, setting her tablet on the desk. "It contradicts everything in the officer's report." Sam leaned forward slightly. "I assumed as much. I also checked your arrest record," Ramirez continued. "No phone call was logged for you. No attempt was made to verify your identity beyond what they saw on your ID. They intended to keep you here all night." Sam's lips pressed into a thin line. "That doesn't surprise me either." Ramirez studied him for a moment, then leaned back in her chair. "I need to ask, why didn't you tell them who you were?" Sam tilted his head. "Would it have mattered?" Ramirez hesitated, then sighed. "Maybe, maybe not. I wanted to see how far they'd take it," Sam admitted. "I wanted to see if they'd follow procedure or if they'd do exactly what I suspected they would." Ramirez nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her expression. "And now you have your answer." "Now I do." A tense silence settled between them. Finally, Ramirez exhaled. "I'll be filing an internal report against Rollins and Tanner. There will be consequences." Sam's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not interested in just consequences, Lieutenant. I'm interested in change." Ramirez met his stare, then nodded firmly. "Then you'll have my support." Sam stood, straightening his jacket. "Good, because this isn't over yet." He turned toward the door but paused before opening it. "One last thing," he said, glancing back. "When did you realize who I was?" Ramirez smirked slightly. "The moment I read their report. It was sloppy, and you didn't react like a guilty man. That told me everything I needed to know." Sam chuckled softly, then stepped out of the office. As he walked through the precinct, officers cast curious glances his way. Some looked guilty, others looked indifferent. But the ones who mattered, the ones like Rollins and Tanner, looked terrified. Sam didn't acknowledge them. He simply walked out the front door into the early morning air, inhaling deeply. The night had been long, the battle was just beginning. The cold morning air did little to cool the simmering anger beneath Samuel Hayes's otherwise calm exterior as he stepped out of the precinct. The night had been long, and though he was now free, the weight of what had happened still clung to him. He had walked into this department with a clear vision, to bring accountability, to dismantle the systemic racism that had plagued law enforcement for generations. But now, just 3 weeks in, he had experienced firsthand the very problem he had set out to fix. Rollins and Tanner thought they could make him disappear, that they could bury the truth beneath lies and false reports. But they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated who they were dealing with. As he crossed the parking lot, his steps steady, purposeful, his mind was already moving 3 steps ahead. This wasn't over, not even close. But before he could take the next steps, he had one stop to make. His SUV was exactly where they had left it, towed and impounded without reason. But Lieutenant Ramirez had ensured it was released immediately. Sliding into the driver's seat, he exhaled, gripping the wheel tightly for a brief moment before composing himself. He had somewhere to be. He didn't head home. He didn't report straight to City Hall. Instead, he drove to the one place he knew would tell the full story, the news station. The footage from his dashcam had already been retrieved, the recording clear and irrefutable. Rollins and Tanner had lied. They had escalated without cause. They had mocked and profiled him without hesitation. And now the world was going to see it. Within an hour, the story was already breaking. News anchors recounted the events with disbelief, playing clips from the dashcam footage that showed Sam driving within his lane, following every instruction, and yet still being treated as a criminal. The recording even captured their racist remarks, their sneers, their casual abuse of power. The video spread like wildfire. By midday, social media had erupted, and the city was demanding action. Sam sat in his office, watching as headlines flashed across the screen. Police chief arrested by his own officers. A case of racial profiling. Unlawful arrest sparks outrage. Chief Hayes speaks out. Calls for reform grow after police target their own leader. His phone buzzed with calls from city officials, community leaders, and activists, all of them wanting to know what came next. But Sam already knew. He turned off the television and leaned back in his chair. The real fight was just beginning. His first order of business was ensuring that Rollins and Tanner faced the consequences of their actions. An internal investigation had already been launched, but Sam wasn't about to let this be swept under the rug. He called an emergency meeting, summoning every officer in the department. Within an hour, the briefing room was filled. The tension was thick, unspoken but undeniable. Officers whispered among themselves, stealing nervous glances at one another. Some looked uncomfortable, others looked defiant. And then Sam walked in. The room fell silent as he stepped to the front, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He had no prepared speech, no rehearsed lines. He didn't need them. The truth was, enough. Last night, he began, his voice calm but firm. I was arrested by 2 of my own officers, not for committing a crime, not for breaking the law, but because they saw a black man driving through the wrong neighborhood. Murmurs rippled through the room, some uneasy, others defensive. Sam let the silence linger before continuing. I was profiled. I was falsely accused. And I was thrown into a cell with no phone call, no verification of my identity, and no regard for my rights. And let me be clear, if this can happen to me as your police chief, it can happen to anyone. His words hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Some officers averted their gaze. Others stared straight ahead, their expressions unreadable. Some of you may believe this was just a misunderstanding, Sam continued. But let's be honest with ourselves. How many times has this misunderstanding happened before? How many times have we looked the other way? How many names have been added to a system that chews them up and spits them out, all because we refuse to acknowledge the problem in front of us? The silence deepened. Sam took a step forward, his eyes scanning the crowd. I took this job to lead, to bring accountability to this department, and that starts now. Effective immediately, Officers Rollins and Tanner are suspended pending a full investigation. But this isn't just about them. This is about us, about what we stand for, about the kind of department we want to be. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded slightly. The department was divided, but that was to be expected. Change wasn't comfortable, it never was. There will be new protocols, Sam announced. Bias training will no longer be optional. Every single case of misconduct will be reviewed. Every officer who thinks they can abuse their power and walk away unscathed. Your time is up. We will be a department that serves and protects, not one that intimidates and oppresses. The weight of his words settled over the room. No one dared to challenge him. Not yet. If you can't stand by these values, Sam added, then you don't belong here. And I will personally make sure you find the door. He let the final words sink in before stepping back. Dismissed. Slowly, the officers filtered out of the room, some glancing back at Sam with wary respect, others with resentment. He knew this was only the beginning. There would be backlash, there would be resistance, but that was the price of change. As the last officer exited, Sam exhaled deeply. The real work started now. The investigation would proceed. The department would be forced to confront its own failures, and the city would be watching every step of the way. But Sam had made one thing clear. This would not be swept under the rug. Justice would be served. The question was, would Rollins and Tanner finally be held accountable for their actions? Comment number 1 if you believe they should face the full consequences of their actions. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because the battle for justice is far from over. The fallout was immediate. Within hours of Samuel Hayes' press conference and the release of the dashcam footage, the entire city was engulfed in controversy. News outlets dissected every second of the video, playing it on a loop, while public outrage erupted across social media. The mayor's office scrambled to control the narrative, issuing a carefully worded statement about the unfortunate incident and vowing a thorough investigation. But the people weren't interested in vague promises. They wanted justice. Protests erupted outside the precinct, citizens demanding accountability. The image of their newly appointed black police chief being unlawfully arrested by his own officers struck a deep chord, reigniting long-simmering frustrations about racial profiling and police misconduct. Signs reading "Justice for Chief Hayes" and "End Racial Profiling Now" filled the streets, and the city's leadership was beginning to feel the pressure. Inside police headquarters, the atmosphere was tense. The once comfortable silence that allowed officers like Rollins and Tanner to operate with impunity had been shattered. Officers who had dismissed Sam as just another bureaucrat now found themselves under a microscope, every action scrutinized. Rollins and Tanner were nowhere to be seen. Suspended pending investigation, they had retreated from the public eye. But their absence did little to ease the department's growing unease. The weight of the scandal loomed over every officer in the building. Sam sat in his office, his phone vibrating relentlessly with calls from city officials, journalists, and concerned citizens. He ignored most of them. He had more pressing matters to handle. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Anita, knocked lightly on his door before stepping inside. "Chief, there's someone here to see you," she said carefully. Sam looked up, weary but alert. "Who?" "Detective Marcus Hill, Internal Affairs." Sam exhaled, nodding. "Send him in." Moments later, a tall man in a gray suit entered, his expression unreadable. Marcus Hill had a reputation for being thorough, relentless in his pursuit of the truth. He wasn't well liked among the rank and file, but that was exactly why Sam respected him. "Chief Hayes," Hill greeted, his voice even. "I assume you know why I'm here." Sam gestured to the chair across from his desk. "I do. Let's not waste time." Hill sat, placing a folder on the desk between them. "I've reviewed the footage. The department is in a difficult position, to say the least." Sam's expression didn't waver. "And?" Hill leaned forward slightly. "And there's more to this than just Rollins and Tanner, officers covering for each other. Evidence disappearing, reports being altered. This isn't just about two bad cops. This is a culture, and it goes deeper than you think." Sam already knew that. He had known it from the moment he took this job. But hearing it confirmed, knowing that Internal Affairs was beginning to connect the dots, only solidified his resolve. "What are you asking me?" he said. Hill studied him for a long moment before speaking. "How far are you willing to go? Because if you want real change, this won't be easy. You're about to make a lot of enemies." Sam didn't hesitate. "I didn't take this job to make friends." Hill nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Then we'll do this the right way. But you need to know, this department won't go down without a fight." Sam leaned back slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Neither will I." Hill stood, gathering his files. "Then let's get to work." As he left, Sam turned his chair toward the window, watching the crowd still gathered outside the precinct. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the people who had been silenced for too long, about the victims who never got justice, about the city that deserved better. He knew what was coming next. The system would push back. The question was, would it finally break? The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable as journalists, community leaders, and police officers filled every available seat. The case against officers Mark Rollins and Jake Tanner had become more than just another misconduct hearing. It was now a national spectacle, a test of whether the justice system could hold its own accountable. At the defense table, Rollins and Tanner sat rigid, their expressions carefully composed, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. Their department-appointed attorney, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a deep frown, was flipping through a thick stack of legal documents, but even he seemed to understand that this case was slipping through his fingers. Across from them, Samuel Hayes sat beside his attorney, Sandra Liu, a powerhouse in civil rights law, with a reputation for dismantling weak defenses with surgical precision. She was calm, composed, and razor-sharp, her fingers tapping lightly on the case file in front of her. Sam, for his part, remained quiet, his expression unreadable. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, But he also knew that in cases like these, truth alone wasn't always enough. The presiding judge, an older man with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings, entered the room, and the murmur of conversation died down instantly. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and addressed the courtroom. We are here today to review the charges of misconduct, wrongful arrest, and racial profiling brought against officers Mark Rollins and Jake Tanner. The prosecution may proceed. The prosecutor, a young but confident woman, stood and walked to the center of the courtroom. Your Honor, what we have here is not just a case of an unfortunate mistake, but a clear example of abuse of power rooted in racial bias. We will present undeniable evidence, including video recordings, that prove beyond a doubt that the defendants targeted, detained, and unlawfully arrested an innocent man because of the color of his skin. She turned toward the jury, letting her words sink in before stepping back. The defense attorney rose slowly, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, while we acknowledge that this incident was regrettable, my clients maintain that they acted within the bounds of their duty. They had reasonable suspicion to stop the plaintiff and followed proper protocol. A quiet scoff rippled through the gallery, but the judge quickly silenced it with a sharp look. The defense attorney continued, "At worst, this was a misunderstanding, not a deliberate act of racial discrimination." Sandra Liu barely suppressed a smile. Walking right into it, she muttered under her breath to Sam. Then it was her turn. She stood, smooth and deliberate, walking toward the jury with the kind of controlled intensity that made her famous. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, allow me to cut through the noise and show you exactly what happened that night. Not opinions, not speculation, but facts. She gestured toward the bailiff, who dimmed the lights as the first piece of evidence appeared on the screen. Dashcam footage from Sam's vehicle. The courtroom fell silent as the video played, showing Sam driving steadily within his lane, the speedometer reading a legal 29 mph. Moments later, Rollins and Tanner's patrol car appeared behind him, turning on their sirens without cause. The video then switched to the officers' body cam footage, their aggressive tone evident from the very first words they spoke. License and registration, and make it quick. The footage continued, revealing the unjustified escalation, the unnecessary use of force, and, most damningly, the casual racist remarks exchanged between the officers. Another one of them causing trouble, Daniels had muttered under his breath. Figures, Rollins had responded with a chuckle. Gasps rippled through the audience, followed by murmurs of disbelief. The judge frowned deeply, his gaze shifting toward the two officers who were now visibly sweating. Sandra let the video play out before pausing it at the exact moment where Sam, fully compliant, was still yanked from his vehicle and shoved into handcuffs. Then she turned to face the jury. "This is not just an abuse of power," she said, her voice measured but unyielding. "This is a direct violation of my client's rights, motivated not by law, but by prejudice." The defense attorney stood, clearly flustered. "Your Honor, the officers believe they had probable cause." Sandra cut him off sharply. "Probable cause based on what? Driving safely? Following instructions? Or perhaps it was simply the fact that he was a black man behind the wheel of an SUV in a predominantly white neighborhood?" The judge banged his gavel lightly. "Let's keep this focused, Ms. Liu." Sandra nodded, but her point had already been made. She turned back toward Sam. "Before we proceed further, my client has something to share with the court." Sam stood, adjusting his suit, and scanned the room. His voice was calm, steady, but carried the weight of everything he had endured. "My name is Samuel Hayes," he began. "I am the chief of police for this city. I was appointed 3 weeks ago to lead this department and address the very issues you have seen here today." A ripple of shock coursed through the room. Reporters furiously scribbled notes. The jury members exchanged glances. Rollins and Tanner looked like they had been struck by lightning. Sam continued. "I chose not to disclose my position that night, Because I wanted the truth to come out organically, without bias or interference, and now it has. He let his words settle before delivering the final blow. This isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows officers like Rollins and Tanner to operate without accountability. That ends today. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the weight of the revelation hitting like a thunderclap. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order. When silence finally returned, he turned to the defense attorney. "Do you have any further arguments?" The attorney hesitated, flipping through his notes, but he knew there was nothing left to say. The evidence was overwhelming. "No, Your Honor," he muttered. The judge nodded before turning his gaze toward Rollins and Tanner. Given the clear misconduct displayed in the evidence presented, I find officers Mark Rollins and Jake Tanner guilty of wrongful arrest and racial profiling. They will be subject to immediate termination and further legal proceedings as determined by the department and state law. The officers' faces collapsed, their smug arrogance from weeks ago now replaced with sheer terror. Their careers were over. As the judge banged his gavel one final time, Sam exhaled slowly. Justice, at least in part, had been served. But as he walked out of the courtroom, flanked by reporters eager for a statement, he knew this was just one battle. The war for true accountability was far from over. Samuel Hayes stepped out of the courthouse into the glaring midday sun. A swarm of reporters pressing forward, their cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward him. The weight of the moment settled on his shoulders. Not just the relief of justice being served, but the knowledge that this fight was far from over. The courtroom had ruled against Rollins and Tanner, and while their termination and forthcoming legal repercussions were victories in their own right, Sam knew that their actions were symptoms of a larger disease. The system had been exposed, but exposure wasn't the same as dismantling. He kept his stride even, ignoring the shouted questions, his expression unreadable. His thoughts were elsewhere. He had seen this cycle play out too many times before. Public outrage, media frenzy, a few heads rolling to satisfy the masses, and then silence, the system returning to its default state of unchecked power and quiet corruption. That would not happen this time, not while he still had a say. A familiar voice called his name, and he turned to see Anita, his assistant, standing near the curb, her phone in hand, eyes scanning the crowd with sharp awareness. "Chief, you need to see this," she said, stepping closer. Without a word, Sam took the phone from her and glanced at the screen. The protests had escalated. The footage of his wrongful arrest had gone viral, but what had started as peaceful demonstrations had begun to shift. In some parts of the city, tensions were boiling over. An emergency city council meeting had been called, and the mayor was already feeling the heat. Sam exhaled, handing the phone back. "Set up a press conference for this afternoon," he said. "We need to get ahead of this." Anita nodded and moved swiftly, disappearing into the crowd as Sam turned toward the U Street, his mind already moving several steps ahead. He didn't head home. He didn't go back to headquarters. Instead, he drove straight to City Hall. Inside, the atmosphere was chaotic. City officials huddled in tense conversations, some glancing at him as he passed, their expressions wary. The mayor was in his office, pacing behind his desk when Sam walked in unannounced. The older man stopped mid-stride, his face tight with barely concealed frustration. "You made quite the mess," the mayor muttered, rubbing his temples. "This isn't just about you anymore, Chief." Sam's gaze didn't waver. "It was never just about me." The mayor sighed, sinking into his chair. "The city's on edge. The governor's office is watching. People are demanding sweeping reforms overnight, and I need to know where you stand on this." "Where I've always stood," Sam replied. "Evenly. We don't just fire 2 officers and call it a day. We overhaul policy, we implement real accountability measures. We rebuild trust, not with words, but with action." The mayor let out a bitter chuckle. "You think it's that easy?" "I think it's necessary," Sam corrected. "And if we don't do it now, the next time something like this happens, it won't just be protests. It'll be riots." The mayor studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Fine, but you take the lead on this. I'm not sticking my neck out unless I know it won't get cut off." "Then stay out of my way," Sam said, turning on his heel and walking out. By the time the press conference was set up, the city's eyes were on him. He stood at the podium, the weight of expectation heavy in the air. "This case was never just about me," he began, his voice steady, carrying across the crowd. "It was about every black man who's ever been pulled over for looking out of place. It was about every citizen who's ever been harassed instead of protected. It was about a system that has allowed officers like Mark Rollins and Jake Tanner to operate without consequence, until now." The crowd was silent, hanging on to every word. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he continued. "But today, we take the first step. Effective immediately, there will be a full audit of police conduct in this city. Every stop, every arrest, every complaint. We will be transparent. We will hold ourselves accountable, because this is not just my fight. It's all of ours." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, followed by scattered applause. Sam stepped back from the microphone, his job far from done, but the path forward now clear. As the sun began to set over the city, he stood at the steps of City Hall, watching as people dispersed, as conversations continued, as change, slow but inevitable, took root. It was only the beginning, but for the first time in a long time, Samuel Hayes believed that beginning might actually lead somewhere. The story of Samuel Hayes is not just about one wrongful arrest. It's about a deeply flawed system that allows injustice to thrive when accountability is absent. His experience highlights the stark reality that racial profiling and abuse of power are not isolated incidents, but systemic issues embedded in law enforcement culture. Had he been an average citizen without the influence of his title, his story might have ended very differently. But his case forces us to ask a critical question. How many others have faced the same injustice without the privilege of visibility? Our lesson here is clear. Change does not happen through silence. It happens when people stand up, when accountability is demanded, and when justice is pursued relentlessly. Sam could have quietly accepted an apology, but he knew that without structural change, another innocent person would suffer the same fate. True justice isn't about punishing individuals. It's about transforming the system that enables them. This story is a wake-up call, not just for law enforcement, but for every one of us. It challenges us to reflect on our role in shaping the society we live in. Do we speak up when we witness injustice? Do we hold those in power accountable? And most importantly, do we demand better from the institutions meant to serve us? What do you think needs to change to prevent incidents like this from happening again? Comment below with your thoughts. If you believe in justice and accountability, hit the like button, subscribe for more powerful stories, and share this video to keep the conversation going. Thank you for watching, and remember, change begins with awareness, but it is fueled by action. Stay informed, stay engaged, and take care.